Hi everyone. We're going to begin. My name is Scott Gleason. I'm chairing the morning session, Gate Crashing Gatekeeping. We had a presenter drop out, unfortunately, so we have a long coffee break, an hour-long coffee break. So we'll have plenty of time for conversation. Our first presenter today is Frank Heidelberger, who is a professor of music theory at the University of Texas. He published books and articles on Renaissance instrumental music, 19th and 20th century music, and the history of music theory. He's the editor of the journal Teoria, Historical Aspects of Music Theory. He also appears on stage as a clarinetist and saxophonist. His talk today is Antoine Reicha's Music Theory and Its Diverse Identities. Please join me in welcoming Frank.
Thank you, Scott, for your introduction, and good morning, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here back in New Orleans and being able to contribute to this topic of identity, which is a very urgent topic. Getting up at 7 o'clock and looking in the mirror, I had a question of identity this morning. Sorry. The spelling of my name is also a matter of identity for me in some way, because the D-E-L in the middle is the correct spelling, and somehow my ancestors dropped that E, and it sometimes gets printed with E and sometimes without E. So the official spelling is this, but it doesn't matter at all. So, but now let's get to my topic, identity questions in Antoine Reicha. Born in Prague, raised and educated in Germany, Anton Reicha developed a distinctive music theory with significant, if not revolutionary, novelties before moving permanently to Paris in 1808 for the second half of his life. In Paris, he first taught privately, then became professor of counterpoint at the Paris Conservatory in 1818. Reicha taught a large cohort of students, besides the often mentioned celebrities like Hector Berlioz, Franz Liszt, and even the young César Franck. One of his students, Daniel Jagensperger, who wrote a theory treatise following in Reicha's footsteps, mentioned in a review of Reicha's Traité de haute composition musicale that there is barely any city in France with at least one music teacher who calls himself a former student of Reicha, and that was written in 1829. In addition, he earned some success as a composer, although most of his compositions were forgotten before his death. Still, Reicha, as a theorist, experienced a steady gradus ad parnassum during his lifetime, climaxing in his appointment to the Institut de France on third attempt in 1835, 1 year before his death. Given these facts, well-known facts, and the considerable difference between his theoretical approach of his early years, let us call it the revolutionary German theory, and the conservative trajectory of his French treatises, we can easily identify the variety of cultural contexts that Reicha was engaged in. However, the challenge remains how to define Reicha's identities as a composer, theorist, and teacher. Researching this topic, I ran persistently into historiographic challenges. It was not easy for me to negotiate historical facts and influences to logically define our understanding of Reicha. For this reason, I see my paper today as an attempt to summarize some of the recent research on questions of Reicha's identity, and then to draw some preliminary conclusions that may lead to future considerations of this topic. After his death, Reicha's legacy was overshadowed by new developments. With the upcoming Romantic movement and the presence of the Neue Deutsche Schule, his name descended to the roster of backbenchers in the history of music. Ironically so, as he was the one who explicitly taught Berlioz and Liszt, and implicitly favored a progressive attitude in music more than anybody else of his contemporaries. Negative comments by François-Joseph Vitis contributed to this massive decline. Referencing the Parisian treatise Cours de composition musicale of 1818, Fétis saw in Reicher's theory of harmony, quote, a conception of the least rational theory that could possibly be imagined, and the most deplorable return towards the crude empiricism of the old methods of the early 18th century. Another colleague of Reicher at the Conservatoire, its director Luigi Cherubini, was also distanced and very critical towards him. Given this level of criticism, studies on Reicher remained scarce for more than 150 years. Aside occasional articles, it took until the new millennium that Reicher received more attention from music historians and theorists on a larger scale. And here, just to survey, it's a lot of text, but that's mostly what I'm referring to. This resulted most notably in the excellent edition of Reicher's early unpublished and forgotten theoretical writings, which includes Reicher's entire German theory, edited by Hervé Orion, Alban Rameau, and Herbert Schneider between 2011 and 2015, the first mentioned here on the slide, and the first conference exclusively dedicated to Reicher, which took place in Paris in 2013. This three-day conference was organized in a fashion that fits our current topic of diverse cultural contexts and identities. The first day, mostly dealing with Reicher's biography and aesthetics, took place on the top level of the beautiful Czech embassy near the Eiffel Tower. The second day, dealing with theory and analysis, took place on the first floor of the Sorbonne University. And the third day, focusing on Reicher's compositional style, was placed in the basement organ room of the new Paris Conservatoire at the Cité de la Musique. In his review of this conference, Christoph Flamm described these venues as a compelling symbol for Reicher's posthumous reception. Quote, such a three-step descent could even stand metaphorically for the abyss of oblivion into which Reicher fell a long time ago. End of quote. This situation has changed drastically during the last decade. The Paris Conference proceedings, published in 2015, and the mentioned edition, enabled the reconstruction of Reicher's identity as a composer and music theorist based on solid source material. Another conference took place in Lucca in 2017, resulting in a volume of proceedings with a promising title, Antoine Reicher and the Making of the 19th Century Composer, published in 2021. And finally, the proceedings of the conference in Brno, 2021, with the title Reicher as Visionary, is currently being prepared for publication. Among the broad research resulting from this new interest in Reicher are topics that explicitly refer to questions of Reicher's identity as a music theorist, such as, and that's the last section here of the slide, such as Keith Chapin's article on Reicher's three identities of the learned musician, and Fabio Morabito's paper on making the modern composer in Haydn's image. I will focus on both articles here, along with Alan Lockhart's article shown on the slide. Chapin identifies Reicher's three identities as learned musician, man of letters, and mathematician, scientist, philosopher. Each of these categories were present in 18th century society for those that deal with art and music either theoretically or practically. And Reicher, according to Chapin, relates to all three categories. He further explains the nature of each of the three categories that can then be mapped onto Reicher's work and biography. The first category, learned musicians that pursue music as a profession, quote, defined themselves through the cultivation of compositional sophistication. They are devoted to one essential question: how is it done? End of quote. The second category, the man of letters, who pursues music as a matter of humanistic interest, is occupied with the, quote, cultivation of proper thought about music, asking the question of how or why did he do it, end of quote. The third category leaves any practical application of musical skill behind and asks, how does it work, or what is it? End of quote. This latter category is of particular interest, as Reicher mentions repeatedly his engagement in mathematical and scientific studies. While it is not explicitly connected with music, research has focused on Reicher's approaches to scientific methodology and mathematical organization of theoretical observations. Alan Lockhart, for instance, interprets Reicher's innovative graphs, form tables, and lists with scientific publications in France at the time. She sees parallels between the diagrams of musical forms in Reicher's treatises and the way French scientists of the period organized chemical elements, as Antoine François Comte de Fourcroy did in 1801, or depicted families of insects in treatises on zoology by Pierre-André Latreille from 1802 on. The term idée mère that Reicher applies to his model of sonata form shows, according to Lockhart, parallels with the term eau mère from Fourcroy's studies of chemical elements. Reicher's identity as a scientist-philosopher clearly reaches back to his German period, where associations with scientific methodologies, terms, and tables can be found in his pedagogical compositions and his manuscript treatises. For instance, the famous description of the sonata form as concubinaire has its origins in his philosophical aesthetic comments to the 24 examples that he wrote most likely in Hamburg before the turn of the century. In the context of his suggestions for a modern revision of established sonata form, Reicher talks around 1800 about a, quote, composition that is organized in two main parts, end of quote, which is the German original of the French term that later became famous through its use in the Traité de Mélodie 1814 and the Traité de Composition musicale. So the German version is Komposition, das die in zwei Teile gegliedert ist, two parts. However, the content of this term, concubinaire, reveals the unique approach of progressive thinking that is typical for Reicher's German music theory. He describes the sonata form with a subsidiary theme in a chromatic third relationship. The principal theme is in D minor, whereas the subsidiary theme is in F sharp major. Reicher admits that this may seem, quote, strange but not unnatural, end of quote. And he concludes, quote, it is a necessity to experiment in art everything that is appropriate to its nature, even connecting the most remote elements as far as one has the means to do so, end of quote. Reicher's rejection of established key relationships of a sonata exposition is one aspect of his almost obsessive ambitions to overturn traditional rules. Let's just listen to that. I talked about this piece in extenso in another presentation, and it will be published eventually. So just here, the idea of going from D minor to F sharp major with a very extensive transition, which reminds actually of another famous piano piece composed by a famous composer at around the same time. Let's just listen to the exposition, which is fairly short. Other aspects of this revolutionary approach to music theory have been discussed widely, such as his use of irregular and compound meter. You could hear this here, alla breve combined with 3/4. The application of chromatic and enharmonic modulations, as well as extensive studies in motivic development and thematic variation. Most well known in this regard are his repeated attempts to establish a new method of fugue composition, published in various collections, again with extensive commentaries to reimagine the genre of the fugue with modern elements. The 36 fugues, 36 fugues composées d'après un nouveau système, which were published in Vienna in 1803, have traditionally been a focus of musicological research on Reicher's identity as a revolutionary theorist. Oliver Vogel sets an extreme tone in his dissertation of 2003. He sees the compositional structure as evidence for a, quote, utopian mission of the fugue, which does not exclude acts of violence, end of quote, identifying these fugues as, quote, revived creatures of a Frankenstein in music, end of quote. Others have put these fugues in various historiographic and theoretical perspectives, including their social contexts and political motivation. Ludwig Fincher interprets these fugues with their seemingly odd juxtapositions of themes in remote harmonic key relationships as products that, quote, lack the aura of the genre, end of quote. Stefan Kunze in 1968 even compares the innovativeness of Reicher's early fugues with the approaches to total serialism by avant-garde composers after the Second World War. Beethoven himself saw them as fugues that are no fugues anymore, and a critic in 1808 called these fugues outcomes of Reicher's attempt to get noticed, which resulted in caricatures of the fugue. The contemporary and posthumous criticism of Reicher's fugues could thus be read as a symptom of cultural anxiety. The fugues, as the epitome of strict composition and established rules idealized in Johann Sebastian Bach's work, is jeopardized by Reicher, who distorted its dignified identity by implementing chromatic key relationships, 5/4 meters, and gallant sentence structures. By way of contrast, Reicher sees the fugue stuck in a tradition that prevented the genre from the adoption of modern compositional devices that would help the genre to become a visionary genre for the new century, and Reicher its visionary creator. Some scholars even attempted to associate this vision with revolutionary ideas. One might not agree with Vogel, who sees the Reicher of the early Hamburg and Viennese period as a representative of Bonapartistic thinking. However, Reicher's writings of these early years, often combining humanistic, philosophical, and political considerations, may allow the conclusion that Reicher defined the traditional fugue as a genre of anachronistic modes of power that were at odds with the revolutionary renewal of society at the time, at least as a hopeful utopia. According to this reading, the Reicher of the period around 1800 aspires to be the figure of the modern composers who overcomes the restrictions of musical traditionalism. This perspective reveals the mindset of a young theorist composer that rebels against restrictions of musical practice that prevented him from the career that he envisioned. Indicators for this mindset can be found in Reicher's autobiographical sketch from 1824, where he relentlessly criticizes the unfair musical management that prevents him from being a productive and successful opera composer. Consequently, so Reicher in his autobiography, he decided to withdraw from the public and live the life of the erudite scholarly theorist sitting at his desk or at the piano with his students. This situation reflects Reicher's philosophy during his formative years, roughly 1798 to 1808, the decade from his time in Hamburg through the first stay in Paris to his Viennese period. This decade can be seen as the key to Reicher's identity. His autobiography and letters talk about this Viennese period as a period of studies and discussion with one central musical figure, Joseph Haydn. While Reicher sees Vianney's musical life on a decline, he adores Haydn and constructs himself as an acolyte of Haydn, advocating for his musical style and pursuing musical development that follows Haydn's footsteps. The dedication of his 36 fugues to Haydn thus is not just an admiration of the aging master, but program. Fabio Morabito concludes that, quote, Reicher's plan to gain enduring luminosity was to do to the fugue what Haydn had done to the string quartet. He wanted to become the father of the fugue by composing anti-fugues, or to say with Beethoven, eine Fuge, die keine Fuge mehr ist, leaving a mark in changing the default of what a fugue was, end of quote. This is a striking idea, well supported by Morabito's arguments. Indeed, during the latter Paris period, Reicher was seen as the representative of Vianney's classical music through the spirit of Haydn. This might explain the mentality of traditionalism shining through the pages of Reicher's French treatises. The revolutionary spirit of the 36 fugues was not opportune at the Conservatoire, and his Traité de haute composition musicale tamely provides traditional rules about the fugue. He still mentions the fugue phrasée, as he calls it in his treatise, as a modern alternative to the traditional fugue. However, this fugue phrasée does not even come close to his early revolutionary experiments. To summarize my preliminary considerations, it remains problematic to speak about diverse identities regarding Reicher, as they can only shape the surface of Reicher's occupation as theorist, composer, and teacher. His transformations from a young revolutionary in German lands under Napoleonic suppression to an established opportunist in post-Napoleonic France are harder to determine. Obviously, his role as a teacher at the Conservatoire allowed him to reintroduce the revolutionary Reicher of the German period under the official cover of the tamed French treatises. As we knew from reports by some of his students, Reicher did not follow strictly his treatises in his teaching, but included manuscripts from his early period. Thus, Reicher, the scientist and philosopher, relies heavily on his pedagogical experience and his compositional attempts. They are indivisible. Reicher's identity is probably better described as a complex, if not contradictory identity, defined by multiple layers that allow him to engage in a multitude of modes beyond the polished pictures of a theory professor at a renowned institution. Uncovering the subtle nuances of these various layers may allow us to better understand the complexity of Reicher's identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. If we could hold questions toward the end, we can have group questions for both presenters. If that's okay. Wonderful talk. Thank you. Our next presenter is Peter Martins, who is Professor of Music Theory and Associate Dean for Faculty, Research, and Creative Activity at Texas Tech University. Dr. Martins holds degrees in music and classics from Lawrence University and the University of Chicago, and his edited translation of Isaac Vossius's The Song of Poetry and the Power of Rhythm has just appeared as part of the Routledge series Music Theory in Britain, 1500 to 1700 critical editions. His talk today is entitled Isaac Vossius, Biography of a Music Theorist. We're quite happy to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. I'll add my thanks to Frank's for the organizers of this, working across societies and especially across budgets. No small task, so thanks a lot for making it happen. I've taken a cue from the session title here and added in kind of true 17th century fashion an alternative title to my talk. It actually fits quite well, I think. So Isaac Vossius is hardly a household name in the world of music theory. If you've encountered this name at all before reading the program for this event, you might be remembering him as quoted in George Hoole's Meter and Music 1600 to 1800. In that book, after a single sentence introducing the long quote from Vossius, which is typical in its academic complexity, Hoole follows with a second and final sentence, the glib observation, he does not give musical examples. That is one of the challenges of the treatise. So the treatise from which Hoole draws that extended quote in that work is entitled De Poematum Cantu et Viribus Rhythmi, on the song or music of poetry and the powers of rhythm of 1673. Vossius's name does not appear at all in the Cambridge History of Western Music Theory, and Bill Kaplan and Pat McCrellis' chapters would have been the most logical places, nor does it appear in Roger Grant's more recent book, Beating Time. Now, even though Vossius's opinions on rhythmo poia were cited and even quoted extensively throughout the 18th century by authors such as Mattheson, Dubois, Rousseau, and Forkel, I hasten to add that the omission by these contemporary authors really does their work no discredit. I don't recall myself exactly where or when I first came into contact with this author or this treatise, but I do know that it was Tom Christensen's fault. In that it occurred during one of his seminars in the early years of the 21st century. I phrase it that way with a mild note of blame, first because he's not here, and second because I've actually spent a good bit of time during the past 20 years or so grappling with my titular paradox. Is Isaac Vossius a music theorist? Is De Poematum Cantu, his only treatise dealing with music, a work of music theory at all? So right off the bat, I'm going to give you the two answers I've come up with, and then I'll work through those answers. I'll next highlight a few aspects of the treatise itself, and then we'll take a vote at the end. Although I'll be happy to entertain write-in candidates during the Q&A if you don't like either of my answers. So my first answer to the overall question is, in fact, no. The treatise, De Poematum Cantu, only had a life, or only came to be at all, due to Isaac's family legacy, which gave him access to knowledge and to ways of knowing, access to people in positions of power, and access to publishing that was very unusual and highly privileged. In this view, he was an intellectual trust fund baby, a fund he lived off throughout his life, or at least until he received a new and more tangible trust fund by inheriting his father's library in 1650 at age 32, which was eventually sold in the early 18th century for close to $700,000 in today's money. Thus, the treatise, again in this view, is the work of a classical dilettante, gate-crashing from above, so to speak, and anticipating a sort of scholarly upper-class twit of the year approach that we might better recognize in 19th and early 20th century England, an approach that merely regurgitates a loosely related concatenation of ancient topics and sources. This is your real cultural literacy test for today, by the way. So that's number one. Answer number two, also no, but maybe. So on the cusp of the Enlightenment, when this treatise was written, works on singular topics by polymath authors were increasingly rare. Had this treatise been written even a little earlier by one of the Galileis or Leonardo da Vinci, or certainly if it had been written a few centuries earlier by Hildegard von Bingen or the Iranian scholar Al-Biruni, or even earlier by Isidore of Seville, or I might even say Boethius, we would likely accept this treatise as written without too much scrutiny. But in its own day, De Poematum Cantu, or rather the approach to scholarship that produced this treatise, was a relic. We get a sense that in some ways the author was as well. In Alexander Chalmers' early 19th century general biographical dictionary, we read that Vossius, quote, understood almost all the languages in Europe without being able to speak one of them well, who knew to the very bottom the genius and customs of antiquity, yet was an utter stranger to the manners of his own times. He expressed himself in conversation as a man would have done in a commentary upon Juvenal or Petronius. And in this scenario, I enjoy rather comparisons with some of the Laputans from Gulliver's Travels, who are so preoccupied with scholarly contemplation that they can't function in day-to-day life, but nevertheless control the intellectual life of their floating city. There is a tenuous connection there, but it's not one I can press very far. So in this view, Vossius was gatekeeping the knowledge and authority from the ancient world by any means possible, with music being just another tool to accomplish that goal. Yet, and here's the maybe, considered atemporally, the treatise can be read as an interesting, encyclopedic, and at times maybe even compelling work on rhythm, language, ancient instruments, and a work that includes a curmudgeonly but well-informed critique of modern music. More on that view a bit later. Now, of course, Vossius couldn't have written this treatise a few hundred years earlier, since it is absolutely dependent on the recovery and assembling of ancient sources in the 15th and 16th centuries, and on the rigorous scholarly attention to those sources in the 16th and 17th. So to understand either his methodology, as I would say number 2 is focused on, or his pedigree as in number 1, let's turn to a little biography finally here. So Isaac is born in 1618 into a scholarly family in the relatively new Dutch Republic, the relatively new Dutch Republic. He was the 7th of nine children, but was the oldest son. His father, Gerhard Vossius, was already at the time of Isaac's birth a significant figure in classical philology and biblical exegesis, and Isaac's early life was spent in Leiden, where his father held prominent positions at the university as the head of the theological school, and later as professor of rhetoric and professor of chronology and professor of Greek. Then a little later, in Amsterdam, where, again, the father Gerhard was the founding chair of history at the new university in Amsterdam at the time. And it's in that city that Isaac became head librarian at age 26. So Isaac was immersed in a highly literary and highly academic family culture. We catch a glimpse of home life in a 1641 letter that's addressed to the then 23-year-old Isaac from a Swedish diplomat named Harold Appelboom, who writes, quote, "In my eyes, your house is a temple in which your father is the oracle of all scholarship, and where your brothers and you all participate as priests." He's trying to get him to come to Sweden, but still. It's certainly evident that Isaac embraced the family trade, benefiting from his father's tutelage and example, but also from his father's reputation, which granted Isaac instant name recognition in and instant access to and mobility between European courts, universities, and governmental institutions. And as I've alluded to, his first position outside of the Dutch Republic was as librarian Greek tutor to Queen Christina of Sweden, where he went in 1648. He fell out with the Queen initially for financial reasons, but her conversion to Catholicism and subsequent abdication ended his employment there. And at that point, he returned to the continent and took up residence at The Hague, where, it so happened, Charles II was waiting out the protectorate with several royalists, one of whom was Henry Bennet, the future Lord Arlington, and the eventual dedicatee of our treatise today, De Poematum Cantu. During these years, it may have occurred to Isaac that his patrimony was both a blessing and a curse. So with his father dead nearly 15 years, Vossius actually received a bit of money and an offer of royal patronage in the form of a history professorship in Paris from Louis XIV. He turned it down. But the official offer letter from the French Controller General of Finance at the time was perhaps one such reminder of his patrimony, for better or worse. Quote, "Everyone knows that you worthily follow the example of the famous Vossius, your father, and that having received from him a name which hath rendered him illustrious by his writings, you will preserve the glory of it by yours." Kind of a second phase of I guess, an academic dynasty, right? Preservation. His dad made it, and he can't better it, he can just preserve it. So let's take a moment to look at the respective output of father and son. And you might think I'm being cheeky here, but as many woodcuts and portraits we have of Gerhard Vossius, there are 0 extant images that I've been able to find, at least of Isaac, which is rather surprising, as you'll see in a second, given the volume of his output. So here are most of Gerhard Vossius's works. And I think you'll notice rather quickly the consistency and his focus on rhetoric, theology, and history, especially of the ancient world. it's a focused career, and it fits with his academic positions. Here are Isaac's works, which start off somewhat typically editions of classical works. There's some religious themes in there. He definitely did get a lot of mileage out of chronology. There was a lot of kind of back and forth and arguing and fighting about some of his views on chronology of the world and of the Septuagint. But then he gets into some things we might not expect. Light, the tides, the motion of the seas and winds, the Nile River. Then we have our music offering kind of in the middle. As every good polymath needs to do, a book of various observations. Whoops, sorry. Which contains really various observations. You've got observations on the conditions of ancient Rome and Alexandria and Babylon, commentary on Roman authors Virgil and Tertullian, and also subjects like how to travel to the Indies and Japan and the geography of Africa. It's really a catch-all. So I think what you'll note here is the inconsistency of Isaac's work in comparisons with his father in the generation or two after his death were not always flattering for this reason. So we read in the early 18th century in the Journal des Travaux, quote, "In the father, judgment prevails, in the son, imagination. The father distrusts the best founded conjectures, the son loves nothing but conjectures, and those bold and daring. The father forms his opinions upon what he reads. The son conceives an opinion and then reads. The father's aim was to instruct, the son's to parade and make a noise. Truth was the father's darling object, novelty the son's. The father has written good books, the son has written curious books." Now, especially because we're at Loyola, I will make note of the Jesuit orientation of the editorial staff of the Journal at the time, which, combined with Isaac's professed and demonstrated skepticism for all things Christian, I think set him up pretty well for this type of ad hominem attack. There's some great stories there that I won't go into. But even with this grain of salt, De Pomatum Cantu is surely one of Vossius's curious books. How did he come to publish it at Oxford? Let's take the last step in his basic biography. So he was invited by Charles II to England in 1670, in the early years of the Restoration. He was made a Doctor of Civil Law at Oxford and then a Canon of Windsor in 1673. He evidently delivered this music work, De Pomatum Cantu, as a lecture at Oxford in 1670 or 71, which suggests that it was actually conceived and written at The Hague, for what that's worth. And then he had it published anonymously in 1673. So I regret in my time this morning that all of the framing that's necessary, I can hardly do justice to a full idea of what's actually in the treatise, but let's at least look at a top-level summary in the form of my own rough table of contents and then a few highlights. It's kind of like a Faulkner novel. It just goes and goes and goes with barely even a paragraph break. So in the interest of making it a little more readable, here are the sections, we might say chapters, I guess, at the time. And there's a lot that's expected. There are a few things that are unexpected. I will admit, given Julia's talk yesterday, I really hadn't paid much attention to the little section on Galen. In fact, actually titling it in the translation as a digression, but I may need to revisit that given her remarks yesterday. There's a lot of fascinating material in here, and authors and little bits of authors, Porphyry's commentary on Ptolemy, especially Theophrastus, that come in kind of these later acoustics and mechanics of instrument chapters that I don't know of anyone else that has done that and that has gotten those sources together in that way. It's definitely the hardest part to translate. All right, so to move on briefly to, I guess I'll say the crux of his argument in what the treatise is mostly known for, its rhythmopoeia argument. So first, in these first several things, he really takes them from Mersenne and Descartes earlier in the century. So he agrees with them that universal proportion cannot provide any sort of master organizing principle behind music, and it really can't do anything with musical expression. He's segueing, as was mentioned in one of the Q&A sessions yesterday, into this notion that music's goal is an arousal of passions. He's really fully there. And then also brings in some of the mechanics of the time. The passions are mental events separate from reason, and there's a sympathetic vibration sort of mechanic that makes that happen. Therefore, the task of the composer and the philosopher to understand is to discover the best way to make this work, govern the mechanism, and influence it. So where I think he builds a bit on his predecessors is in not following someone like Burmeister and focusing on the Figuren, but really focusing on poetic feat, very specifically. Of course, in his own mind, pro-ancient and anti-modern mind, there really hasn't been any decent music since ancient Greece, because this mechanic has not been employed by composers. And then overall, and this is not an uncommon theme, when used correctly, poetic feat themselves are bearers of that meaning to the human spirit. So in these last two, Vossius both highlights the problem of application and then finds the solution of it by reaching back to antiquity. So two more quick curiosities in the work, to our mind anyway. They come up with only the two plates that exist in the work. So the first reproduces two ancient lyres, which are accompanied by a cogent and somewhat prescient argument that the organological evidence from ancient statuary or ancient relief really should not be always taken at face value. So he speaks about the elements that are added to human forms in classical statuary, basically saying they're not to scale. Quote, "These features should be attributed to the artisans and the sculptors who, as everybody knows, during the whole history of art, fashioned swords and spears and anything else that projected outward from the statue in less than full size." So part of the fashion at the time was to take these classical exemplars as gospel truth. These two lyres come from two marble statues of Apollo that evidently at the time were in Charles II's garden. And he transcribed them and provided enough detail in the text to harmonize with ancient descriptions and to create these diagrams. There are two different types of harp. The one on or lyre, the one on the right is the theatrical version because it's got these resonating chambers that make it project more evidently. He also uses the detail here to remark on ancient scale systems and also to correct some earlier authors' ideas on the subject. And he's invoking what I would essentially call an embodied cognition approach. So something like, the scales must have been this way because this is how the fingers would have interfaced with the strings on the lyre. All right, the second plate is a highly detailed depiction of Vitruvius's water organ, or hydraulis. And this section of De Pomatum Cantu and the text surrounding this plate is really a detailed step-by-step account of how this thing works and how it could actually be built. This is the part of the treatise that I have found to be the most widely cited and quoted and translated in the 18th and really in the 19th and even the 20th centuries, since it is evidently the most comprehensive and knowledgeable account of ancient water organ construction that's available. And you can get a basic idea how it works. The water is just simply providing the pressure, and the pipes would sit in these the toe board up here on top. That's what those little holes are. So it's a self-contained apparatus. So this treatise, I think, hopefully you're getting the sense, is curious indeed. Curious, but not the least noticed of Vossius' works. In Thomas Seacombe's Dictionary of National Biography, late 19th century, we read, quote, "What is perhaps the most original of the works of Vossius appeared anonymously in 1673. So it's called the most original here. And the summary is the author retraces the ancient alliance between poetry and music and insists upon a strict adherence to the rules of prosody." That's not an unfair summary. Closer to his own time, however, the reviews of the treatise are best maybe viewed through the lens that the only bad critical response is no critical response. So our first response, fairly early after its publication by Roger North, Quote, "The author of this charge writes of the modern music with as much ignorance as ever yet abased a subject in print, and with a doctoral superciliousness equal to, if not exceeding, his ignorance." Ouch. Yeah. And then a little bit later, from John Brown, paraphrasing the first part of his statement, "Aside from a few kernels of wisdom in the treatise, it, quote, may be justly thrown aside as husk and shell." Let me end the string of quotations by letting Vossius finally speak for himself. So the treatise is heavy, as I've mentioned, on pro-ancient and anti-modern sentiment like this. Quote, "Let all the libraries be scoured. We are compelled to acknowledge that the record left to us by antiquity is better." I kind of imagine him, banging on a lectern with a shoe or something at the Sheldonian Theater. But he also strikes a more reasonable, even conciliatory tone here and there, such as this, quote, "I will be satisfied if the only result I achieve with the treatise is to have today's musicians think more favorably of the music of the ancients and more modestly when it comes to their own." So, to conclude and hopefully come to something of a full circle, maybe the question is not whether or not Isaac Vossius was sufficiently musical to be a music theorist, but whether music theory in the West had and has remained sufficiently connected with general intellectual inquiry to accept this treatise as music theory. One main reason, or perhaps the main reason, that Vossius could be seen as a model gatekeeper is that his area of study, classical antiquity, had already ceased to be the lens through which all subjects were viewed, or the metaphor under which all philosophical inquiry into all those subjects was done. In approaching his subjects this way, music included, I would argue that Vossius actually assumed the identity of an author from classical antiquity. And judging from the more positive strands of his reception during the 18th century, again by Mattheson, Rousseau, Forkel, and others, he is essentially treated as one, put up against in lists with Aristides Quintilianus and Quintilian and Ovid and Aristoxenus. So he's not treated as an ancient author in terms of chronology, of course, but in terms of authority. So my conclusion is that Isaac Vossius, having spent his life immersed in the wisdom of ancient authors, eventually became one himself. And this is more in line with the second answer I proposed at the outset. So if we do accept him as a music theorist, I believe we have to understand him, husk and shell and all, in that spirit. Thank you. I think we're supposed to go to the table now, right?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah. I'll leave this up just because it's fun to look at.
Thank you, Peter and Frank. Please feel free to have a seat. There's microphones. And how's the Q&A? Thank you both for wonderful talks. Really appreciate it. Does
Thank
anyone
you.
want to start us off with a question? Or thought?
I have a thought, maybe for Frank, but maybe for both of you. I was really struck in your paper, Frank, the idea of focusing on pedagogy in sort of biography and reception of a music theorist, because I feel like there's kind of increasing attention to like pedagogy in composer biographies, but despite the fact that we all or most of us teach, we tend not to think of looking at the works of someone's students, in this time as a way of thinking about their theoretical contributions. So not a question, just a thought.
Good point. Thank you for pointing that out. I think really, and that does not just apply to Reicher, but that's maybe a general tendency in certain strands of historical theoretical considerations that there is really one perspective, that's the print perspective, and another perspective that's what is actually taught and how it is taught. And one could actually add a performative perspective of what the the instrument idea of the theorist is, that depending on what instrument he plays or she. And I think that really has to be taken into consideration in order to understand really how theory was understood at its certain time and place, and more than just opening a treatise and seeing, oh, the person writes this and that's what is face value, but there's more behind it, and I think that particularly applies to Reicher and requires more research.
Can we call teaching applied theory? Just not say teaching anymore.
August, please.
Very basic question about Reiche. How did he identify himself in terms of nationality, or did he identify as Czech or Bohemian or German or adopted Parisian? And if you know, and do you think that played into in any way his not being French, his reception by Fétis and Carini and the others? I mean, they were not French either, but
Wonderful. That's a central question for the understanding of this whole identity issue with Reicher, and maybe I have not focused enough or at all in that perspective that I presented in my paper. On one hand, we do not have too many authentic biographical or autobiographical information by Reicher. There's always a in between the lines perspective to that. But just from his autobiography, he says the Czech background, he left Prague when he was 11 years old, kind of at night, jumping on a wagon and leaving. He wasn't very happy there. So later he says, I forgot Czech language completely. This has nothing to do with me. So he kind of really tries to make believe that he ignores that background. His German experience was mixed in that way that his stepmother was actually French, and so he learned French and German at the same time, so that it was not really an exclusive German influence. He was bilingual from that perspective, so that helped him. Later, having this idea probably from other musicians that he knew from Bonn, now the name eluded for me, the Romberg father and son, and Andreas Romberg and such, who probably encouraged him to go to Paris. He all of a sudden is French all over. So he's dedicating his treatises and such to the main representatives, Gossec, Méhul, and so on, of the early conservatoire time. So a little bit of opportunistic adjustment of how he sees himself as from national identity point.
thank you.
Question about Vossius. Of course, the other place where we most likely to encounter his name is in the 300 some odd manuscripts in the Codices Vossiani that have all been digitized now by Friedel, etc. Wonderful resource, but it's also remarkable how wide-ranging his library was. So one question I have is about his sources, and one source in particular, does he care about Augustine's De Musica, which I would imagine he would find a kindred spirit and an insistence on the role of feet, but also does he care about the Aristotelian tradition of rhythmics and metrics and some of the complex relationships there within much more of the Greek side of things than what actually ends up playing out in the Latin West?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've been hoping for many years to go to Leiden and just spend like a year there, probably combing through the sources and looking for marginality and that sort of thing. I really would like to see his the copy of Mersenn's Harmonie Universelle. I'm sure that's full of great stuff. Augustine does not even seem to be alluded to directly, but as we were talking beforehand, neither does Kierkegaard, and he surely knows that work, and you can kind of see it around the edges, but he was not in the habit of, and it kind of comes with the territory of the time, he doesn't cite contemporary authors, even though he borrows, and in the case of the Harmonie Universelle, has some very close paraphrasing for large chunks of time in it. So, yeah, and then the other part of your question, he is obviously a Grecophile in the extreme. So I'm trying to remember, and I could check the index quick, whether he actually mentions Aristoxenus by name. I mean, Ptolemy, yes; Porphyry, yes; all those, kind of whatever early CE figures. Yeah, I will have to check and get back to you. But I think that's very fair to say that's the strand he's really picking up on that wasn't picked up on so strongly in the folks before him.
On the subject of Vossius and his identity, any thoughts on his decision to publish it anonymously?
Many, none of them necessarily are founded. What was it a thing? And I guess I'll throw this question back to the room. If you are publishing kind of one-off treatises, is it better for it to come out anonymously? Does it have more life? And I'll give some answer to that, in that the treatise actually had more legs in some respects than the man who wrote it. So Mattheson quotes it and actually misattributes it to the dad. And it was one of those works that seems to have achieved the status of quotability. That work about Rhythmopoeia by that Dutch guy, Vossius. Oh yeah, it must be Gerhard, right? He's the only one I know. Rousseau, Rousseau, 3 of the entries in his dictionary draw heavily on Vossius, and he's cited in the one on rhythm. But Rousseau botches the title of the treatise rather badly. It was clearly the treatise, but he messes up the title. So it kind of circulated almost as much by reputation, I think, as by kind of someone going and getting it from the library. It also could have been a vanity publication that he just did himself and gave out to his friends. Again, I don't know how common this is. I'm no expert on the publication practices of the time, but a lot of the extant copies, there are certain typos that have been corrected clearly at the same time by the same hand. Maybe right at the publishing house, or Vossius got them all and was looking them over like, darn it, and went through them all and did it. So I'm not sure. Some of the other strange ones, the one on the winds and tides, he did sign. The one on optics, he was attributed. So it's not his only anonymous treatise, but it's not the thing he did. So I'm curious if anyone else has a thought on that. Yeah, please. Hi, Roger.
Well, first of all, this is amazing. I've been waiting for a long time for your translation, and I'm really excited to read it. And this talk has even made me more excited. And something that I think you're helping us to realize is that this treatise is actually a little bit different from some of his others, insofar as it might be participating in the quarrel between ancients and moderns, right? Like what Jean de Jean calls ancients and moderns. And in that sense, I think it actually does make sense as an anonymous publication, rather than something so informational as like on winds and tides, that's going to be kind of granting him authority in that particular field. But this might be kind of like a polemic, you guys are doing it wrong, we lost the ancient way, this is the way to do it. And so, I don't know, maybe you see it as a little bit more polemical in that sense.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I will say that he was not shy about being polemical in public. There's a lot of controversy on this, that, or the other thing, but that makes complete sense to me. I'll also add that there are some very interesting, I'll say, anticipations of the 18th century chorale in this treatise, that he had his finger on those issues quite a bit ahead of the time when they came to a head in France. So yeah, but he's definitely on the ancients side, on the ancients team for sure. No bones about it. So yeah, maybe it was better for him to keep his head down a little bit in that respect.
Stefan?
Yeah, thank you both. Those are two wonderful case studies. I was wondering, the question, was he a music theorist, was Vossius a music theorist? I wonder if it depends in part to what the disciplinary identity of music theory is at that time, and I wonder if you would comment on that, because obviously I think that also is a moving factor, right? I mean, being a theorist at the time is not the same as, or in the Netherlands, is not the same as being a theorist in Renaissance Italy or France. So I wonder how he saw himself. I don't know if he has a sense of what he was actually doing by piling together this enormous amount of knowledge in this, this is like a typical polymath. If he had some idea of his own self-identity was, I don't know if we can glean it in any way. But,
yeah, I might go back to the kind of the previous remarks and Roger's question that I think he saw himself as a champion of the ancient world, and then did what many ancient and medieval authors did in using music to prove the larger point. So I guess that's where I would say he wouldn't claim the music theorist identity for himself, but that's maybe even an anachronistic thing to say. Like, what was there such a thing where he was at the time? But it is an interesting moment of transition, right? I mean, the early Restoration, Civil War period that we were kind of segueing rather rapidly. So I mentioned Kierkegaard before, who probably would have adopted the mantle of music scholar or whatever, but was similarly broad in his writings and knowledge than Vossius. And just really a generation later, I guess, Vossius is doing something different because the context is that different. And maybe Kierkegaard's context is just that different from England. Forget about the time difference too. So yeah, I think, and I guess it was Andrew yesterday that talked about the pivot at this point away from ancient sources as the authority. It's funny because Isaac's halfway there. He's talking about the passions, and he's adopting these rather more modern, at least 17th century ways of thinking about music. But at the same time, it's the connection, why that's important, is ancient as well. Numerical proportion isn't important anymore. That's not why we go back to the ancient world. We go back for precisely the topics of the day. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I ask a question? Vossius, you understandably spend a lot of time on kind of reception of the son in relation to the father, and we can identify him in a certain way via that relationship. But there was overlap in their publication history, so is there a sense of what the father thought of the son?
That's a great question, and I haven't seen anything. Not even a hint that they were estranged or even intellectually estranged as far as their approaches. Yeah, I'm not sure.
You quoted one person as saying that the son merely preserves what the father is doing. The father in a sense is a trailblazer. But then there's another quote about the son. I forget the final word that put the nail in the coffin. But the son is kind of being avant-garde for avant-garde's sake almost. So that might relate to it somehow. There's a bit of tension there in the two interpretations.
Yeah, when your father's a modernist composer, you have to be a postmodernist composer? I mean, maybe it's just that simple. I don't know.
No, but it definitely brings up this question of identity and generations of, both literal and figurative sons of the fathers, and, it's very interesting. How you strike out on your own as a thinker.
You've talked a little about the question of who is a music theorist, and is Vossius one? But I want to ask you, what is the definition in your mind, working with his writings, of what is music theory?
I mean, to this room, maybe I could say, compiling, assembling, and understanding what has come before is absolutely one definition of music theory, and by that definition, 100% yes. If we think of it more as system building and clarity and a logical argument, not so much. So I'm certainly willing to go with the first, but I'm not sure that that's where our discipline is as a whole at this moment. Again, happy to have people opine on that from the group here too.
It's an important question to consider, because I think it applies to what you're doing, and also I've done a fair amount of work on writings about jazz before people thought of the field of jazz theory, and so what were those things? And so it applies to so many different things, and even when you get the question of theorizing, but the person who's doing it might not think that they are, are the Kaluli of Papua New Guinea theorists, music theorists, so it's a question that applies in so many areas, and if we're not thinking about that question, I think that's what this whole conference is about, is not just the identity of the people we're studying, but the identity of the field and our position in it.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And you mentioned jazz. I was just speaking yesterday with Clay, I think, who was here, who's done some work on Eric Dolphy, and barely anything written by him, but there is, you could say that there is theorizing going on in what he wrote and how he did it, and you can see his process through his the manuscript trail that we have. So, yeah, it's a big question. We can certainly look elsewhere than just the publications. Yeah.
Is the point, what do you make of the answer? I mean, why does it matter if he is or he isn't?
Yeah,
I mean, that's...
I think it's completely separable whether the writer is a theorist and whether the writing or the statement is theory. And so whether or not Vossius considered himself as a music theorist, for myself, I have a very broad definition of theory. Is it about music? Check.
Right.
Does it say anything about the organization or, materials of music or composition? Check. And so I hope that we'll, all be bringing a lot more into the consideration of music theory than, as you said, the field already does.
I would just say, I think Vossius would be confused by the question. And I imagine, he would have, maybe he doesn't, but other models, maybe, Cardano's Days of Duetate, which has, big chunks on music and Gallagher's reply to it, etc. I don't think we would have arguments about whether Cardano and Gallagher are music theorists, etc. And I think Vossius really belongs within that kind of polymathic man of letters, etc. space, which means that music is fully within, the domain that could be broached. So
It's a question of our time that we're trying to answer, and there's something to be learned from examining the historical record in doing so.
Right. But essentially for us it means how seriously shall we take him, right? Because if we decide a priori that he's not, he's a polymath, so you may read it in a different way from a priori than if you're reading, someone that we think to be, an Artusi or a Zalino or a Ramon. So right there you just approach his text differently.
I have a question for Frank, if I may. Kind of on that note that, I mean, we're what, 150 years essentially between the two folks we're talking about. Has the definition of, or has the horizon of knowledge expanded so much that when we get to Reiche's time, that he is essentially a polymath in his own context, writing as he did in the kind of the three main ways that I think you drew from another author early on in the talk. And it's part of the larger question of increasing specialization. Right now in the early 19th century, if there's 8 billion things to know instead of 1 billion things to know, what counts is, if you still know 1 billion of those 8, are you a polymath in that context?
I think he tries to be a polymath in that sense, but in a very different sense from that century, because of course the Enlightenment influence which he plays on a lot and tries to identify himself as a humanistic, but in that sense modern technical theorist. So what does that mean? I think in his aesthetic considerations, as he often calls in subtitles some of his writings, he often tries to show that if you do this right, then you will be a better human being, down to that sense. Almost in that naive sense, sounding a bit naive, but he has always this attempt to justify technical aspects of music theory as something that makes you better. So again, that's a pedagogical thing, maybe, On the other hand, it's very interesting. What did he actually publish out of this stuff that he is? And it is only to make it simple, it's only the technical part. So he has a huge French manuscript written before the Traité de Mélodie, which is called something like Philosophical Aesthetic Considerations, and that remains manuscript. He doesn't publish that.
Do you have a sense of why it wasn't published?
I think by that time he wanted to buy into the structures of academia at that time, especially the conservatoire. He wanted a job, and so he needed to show he's an expert in counterpoint. That's what counts, and not philosophizing out there somewhere, which was probably even seen as something suspicious at that point. We're talking about the time 1814 through 1818, one of the most transitional periods of politics and social life in France anyway. So, so I think that the tendency of polymath is in there, and he tries to identify himself very much in the early times, but later not so much.
August again, please.
The framing of Vossius as engaged in a polemic between ancients and moderns makes a lot of sense. But I was struck by one of the items in your table of contents, both for its kind of the early date of this work, but also not sure where it would fit into that, which is the Chinese versus European song. And just wondered if you could say any more about it.
Yeah, there's actually a term I've run across to describe. I guess it's mostly a continental thing in that part of the 17th century, sino-fanaticism. It's a great one of those great words. And Vossius had a serious case of it. I mean, he could have died of it. I think it was so bad. Yeah. There's a quote. Actually, Abbé Dubois, one of the folks that cites his work in the 18th century, says, there's this interesting treatise. It's on rhythm and meter and poetry, and here's the title. And I think it's by Isaac Vossius because it's got all of these prejudices in favor of China, and everyone knows that this guy was crazy about China. So it actually became kind of a calling card to posterity. And that's the only mention in the treatise that kind of rose to the level of a section title, because it goes on for a little bit. But there are other mentions of, actually in the section on Galen and pulse theory, he says, oh, the European doctors will kill you. You know, the Chinese doctors really understand all this much better than our doctors do. So I don't really know much about where that comes from at that time period, or where he got it from in particular, but he's definitely on the, again, if anyone else knows more about that side alley of it, I'm interested to know.
Sorry, if there's time for one more question?
I've lost track of time myself, so, but we have plenty of time.
I do not know more about the reception of the Chinese song in this time, but I did have one more question for Frank. I was very curious about the autobiographical sketch, and I'm just, when was that from? I'm just trying to place it in connection with other, like the phenomenon of composer biography and autobiography.
Reicher dictated that draft. It's really just a draft. He dictated it to one of his students. What's his first name? Blanchard is the last name. Is probably, one doesn't know exactly, but that was his kind of his assistant, his teaching assistant, you would say today. Henri Blanchard in 1824. So right before he publishes his latest treatise on Traité de haute composition musicale, so the counterpoint, roughly spoken, counterpoint treatise, the third one of that row of French treatises. It's really not very well known for what reason, maybe for advertisement, for publication. He was by that time a kind of famous theorist. But it was not published. It was again, that lack of scholarly work about Reicher. It took into the 20th century that interestingly, a Czech translation was published in the 1930s or so, and it took quite a while before it came out, and yeah, it took till 2011 that this series of editions that we have a scholarly edition of the autobiography, and it is insofar a draft as it's written both in first person and third person singular, so mixed. So it must have been dictated at different times, and as it was typical back in some houses, he did this and he did that, and then in another part, I studied and so on. So it's very weird.
I'm thinking there might be an interesting comparison with Ignaz von Lützow's Salieri biography, which is also from the 20s and based on interviews and partial dictations of reminiscences.
It's a good point. There's no real evidence for it, but it could have been the original idea to write a biography and so to get autobiographical information for that. But there's no real evidence for that.
We have plenty of time, but we could also pause here unless there are other questions. Thank you so much, both of you.
On the China thing, I neglected to mention, sorry, I'm going to give you whiplash here going back and forth. Really, I think the best context to understand that, all of that part of the treatise is that it's yet another bit of evidence in favor of the ancients. So ancient Europeans, we had it, we screwed it up, we've lost it for the last 12 centuries. The Chinese had it and still have it. So we should really follow the model. That's the basis.
Thank you again. Thank you so much.